Opening shot. Dim concert hall. Soft piano music fades in. Cut to black and white photo of a young blind boy standing next to a Steinway piano. Narrator, calm, gripping tone. He was blind. He was black. He was mocked by one of the greatest pianists alive. But when he sat at that piano, everything changed. Dramatic beat drop. What started as a joke in front of New York's elite would become the most unforgettable moment in classical music history. The air inside the Lincoln Arts Center that night was thick with prestige. Velvet-draped seats lined with patrons in diamonds and designer suits. The scent of wealth and influence lingered in every corner. Conversations were hushed, polite, and laced with the subtle arrogance of those convinced they belonged. A Steinway grand piano rested center stage, bathed in golden light. No one in the crowd expected anything unexpected. No one imagined that the night would belong to anyone but the celebrated maestro himself. And then he appeared, a boy, no older than 16, guided gently by his teacher. His dark glasses caught the reflections of the stage lights. In one hand, he held a white cane. In the other, nothing, no program, no sheet music, just silence, the kind that follows someone who doesn't fit in. He didn't look like he belonged, but he stood tall, still, his presence demanding something no one there was ready to give. Attention. Visual, elegant Lincoln Arts Center, evening gowns, tuxedos, champagne flutes. At the Lincoln Arts Center, the night glittered with money, power, and prestige. New York's musical elite gathered to raise funds and show off. The chandeliers sparkled like constellations overhead. Waiters moved like shadows, offering flutes of champagne that never seemed to empty. Everywhere you looked, it was elegance and self-congratulation. Art collectors, media moguls, and silver-haired patrons of the arts exchanged air kisses and whispered about their latest acquisitions. The room was alive with the kind of luxury that didn't just speak. It whispered in code only the privileged understood. Among them, a 16-year-old blind boy named David Thompson. He wasn't a guest. He was a charity ticket tag-along, brought by his underpaid public school music teacher. David wore a second-hand suit and clutched a white cane. He didn't glide into the room the way others did. He didn't wear a name that earned nods of recognition. Instead, he was walked in gently, his teacher's hand a quiet anchor against the rising tide of judgment. His shoes were slightly too big, his shoulders too tense. And yet, there was something unshakably still about him, like he knew something no one else did. Flash cut. Vincent Sterling enters a hall, flashing cameras. At the center of it all, Vincent Sterling, a global piano icon, master of Chopin, millionaire, arrogant, and dangerously threatened by anyone who didn't look the part. As he stepped through the gilded entrance, camera flashes lit up his path. The room tilted toward him with automatic reverence. Every hand reached out, every smile widened. He was the reason they had come. The genius, the headliner, the untouchable. He saw everything, except the boy with the cane. As Vincent took the stage, he spotted David near the piano. The lights had dimmed to a golden glow, the kind reserved for moments meant to impress. Vincent basked in the admiration, a practiced smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He adjusted his cufflinks, then turned his gaze toward the unexpected presence by the Steinway. David quiet, still, clearly out of place. Vincent voiceover reenactment. "Hey kid, how about playing something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday." A ripple of laughter passed through the audience. Polite but sharp, the kind of laughter meant to sting more than amuse. A few guests exchanged knowing glances, as if they had all just been reminded of why inclusion wasn't always convenient. Audience laughter fades in. David remains motionless. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, white cane in hand, the noise around him falling away. What Vincent didn't know, David had practiced 8 hours a day for years on a borrowed keyboard in a church basement. At just 3 years old, he could recreate entire symphonies from memory. Close up, David gripping his cane tighter. The church piano had missing keys. It was always slightly out of tune. But that basement had become David's sanctuary, the only place where he could transform his grief into something beautiful, something alive. He had never once asked the world to see him. But now the spotlight had found him anyway. Then, calmly, he spoke. David, VO. Actually, I prefer Bach. A hush fell over the room. It was as if the air itself paused. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. The glint of crystal glasses suddenly felt too bright. Even Vincent tilted his head, momentarily unsure whether to laugh again or feel challenged. Vincent chuckled condescendingly. Bach, huh? What piece? David. Partita number 2 in C minor. But maybe that's too advanced for this audience. And just like that, the power in the room shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The laughter died. The glances grew nervous. And Vincent Sterling, master of every room he'd ever entered, felt the first flicker of something unfamiliar, unease. The insult stung. Vincent laughed it off, barely. But now he was determined to humble the boy publicly. His fingers slid into place on the polished keys of Steinway. He leaned into the first few bars of the partita, letting his hands glide over the keys with theatrical flair, exaggerating each note as if to put on a show, not for beauty, but for dominance. This was no longer about the music. It was about putting David in his place. But just as the final note of the first phrase hung in the air, David's soft voice cut in again. David, you played it in D major. Bach wrote it in C minor. A silence fell sharp and immediate. It was as if someone had thrown a stone into still water. The ripples traveled fast. Vincent froze. He had intentionally changed the key. A small test, a trap, a game, and the blind boy had caught it. The room shifted again. You could feel it, the discomfort, the hesitation. Murmurs moved to the rows like a rising tide. Cut to audience murmurs. Dr. Webb frowns. Margaret Rothschild scoffs. Dr. Harrison Webb, one of the most respected conductors in the country, narrowed his eyes and tilted his head slightly, studying David with a new lens. Margaret Rothschild, her pearl necklace glinting under the lights, leaned toward her companion and scoffed under her breath. But even she couldn't deny what she had just witnessed. David stepped forward and laid his cane beside the bench. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second guessing, just a quiet sense of purpose. He sat down at the piano, not to prove himself, but to speak a language only few truly understood. Before playing, he turned slightly toward the room and asked, David, has anyone here ever lost everything they loved and rebuilt their soul note by note? Now it wasn't performance. It was a reckoning. The lights suddenly felt too bright, the silence too loud. It was no longer about a boy and a piano. It was about what happens when truth walks into a room dressed in humility and refuses to bow. Narrator. David's fingers touched the keys, and the room vanished. The chandeliers, the velvet seats, the murmuring patrons, all of it disappeared. There was only the sound. A single note, then another, then a phrase that seemed to rise up from a place deeper than memory. The music didn't just begin, it breathed. Each note carried the weight of his past. The car crash that took his sight and his parents. The hospital bed where silence was more deafening than pain. The echoing church basement where he spent endless hours practicing while other kids played outside. The loneliness, the frustration, the aching grief, all of it poured out now note by note. The piano was no longer an instrument. It was a confessional. And David? He was the truth spilling out. Montage. Faces stunned, Margaret Rothschild crying, Deborah clutching her chest. Across the audience, expressions shifted. Some leaned forward, stunned. Others sat frozen, eyes wide, breath held. Margaret Rothschild, who had smirked earlier at the boy's boldness, now had tears streaking down her powdered face. Deborah, sitting quietly in the fifth row, clutched her chest with both hands, tears welling up as she watched the child she had raised channel a storm into beauty. Vincent stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his chest tight. He recognized every phrase, technically flawless, every passage executed with precision. But that wasn't what shook him. It was something else. Every note was technically flawless, but emotionally transcendent. David wasn't just playing Bach. He was talking to him. He was playing the tears, not the notes. Narrator. When David finished, there was silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that asked for permission